Hello there. Welcome to an all-new season of Planet America. I'm John Barry.
And I'm Chaz Licciardello.
And what a week to come back, Chaz. On the very day a former American president was in court to plead not guilty to charges he conspired to illegally stay in power.
Yeah, we got a lot to say about that one. And also we're going to look at the other 70-odd charges being laid against Trump. We're going to check in on the Hunter Biden case. The presidential campaign itself, there is so much to cover.
So much.
Let's get cracking.
Earlier today, America's 45th president, Donald Trump, was in Washington, D.C. to face court for the first time since being indicted over an alleged conspiracy to hold on to the presidency despite knowing he'd lost to Joe Biden in 2020. A grim-faced special counsel, Jack Smith, had outlined the prosecution's case against Trump on Tuesday night.
Today, an indictment was unsealed, charging Donald J. Trump with conspiring to defraud the United States, conspiring to disenfranchise voters, and conspiring and attempting to obstruct an official proceeding.
Smith said that his office would pursue a speedy trial. A hearing to decide on a trial date has now been set for the end of the month. President Trump's initial reaction on his Truth Social platform was to basically ask, what took you so long?
Why didn't they bring this ridiculous case 2.5 years ago? They wanted it right in the middle of my campaign. That's why.
Trump's former Vice President Mike Pence, who is now running against him for that Republican presidential nomination, is likely to be a key witness in this case. And Pence's statement following the Trump indictment inched a little further away from his old boss, declaring, "Today's indictment serves as an important reminder anyone who puts himself over the Constitution should never be President of the United States." Well, in between ads for dental implants, CBD oil and clips from his defenders on Fox News, Trump hit back on Truth.
I feel badly for Mike Pence, who is attracting no crowds, enthusiasm, or loyalty from people who, as a member of the Trump administration, should be loving him. He didn't fight against election fraud.
And yes, Trump is still maintaining there was election fraud,
which we will now be easily able to prove based on the most recent fake indictment and information which will have to be made available to us. Finally, a really big deal.
This trial is going to prove that he was right all along. That is certainly looking on the bright side. And he formally entered a plea of not guilty today after being fingerprinted and read his Miranda rights. President Biden has made no comment, but perhaps rather pointedly, Chaz, he did head off to the movies in Delaware Tuesday night with First Lady Jill Biden to see, it turns out, Oppenheimer, about the father of America's nuclear program.
I don't know if you're saying that the indictment was a huge explosion or that Jack Smith bombed out. I'm not sure.
Maybe just a reminder of the stakes when it comes to the presidency.
Sure. Either way, let's talk about this indictment. Now, Jack Smith tried not to prosecute Trump for his political views. He actually started the indictment by declaring explicitly that Trump has the right to speak publicly about the election, to claim that there was fraud and that he won. He has the right to formally challenge the results as well, which he did. But he doesn't have the right to pursue unlawful means discounting legitimate votes. In this case, actions speak more illegally than words. Also, to be found guilty of a conspiracy, you need to conspire, i.e. your actions need to be corrupt or fraudulent. So if Trump truly believed that all his election theories were true, well, he'll be acquitted. And Trump's lawyers are onto that.
The president believes in his heart that he had not only responsibility, but the right as any American to contest issues in the 2020 election, to raise important facts that the public needed to know.
I would like them to try to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that Donald Trump
Believed that these allegations were false.
See, that's why when you read the indictment, Jack Smith used the phrase knowingly false to describe Trump's statements 33 times. He needs to show that Trump knew he didn't actually win the election. He was trying to steal the election corruptly. So how do you show that? The indictment states that Trump was notified repeatedly that his claims were untrue, often by people on whom he relied for candid advice on important matters and who were best positioned to know the facts. And he deliberately disregarded the truth. Jack Smith went on to detail an exhaustive list of times when that happened. From the Vice President to senior Department of Justice appointees, the Director of National Intelligence, security experts, senior White House and campaign officials, and state legislators and officials. But how can you prove that Trump believed all those people? Maybe he was particularly stubborn. Maybe he was irrational, John.
That's plausible.
Well, Jack Smith tries to deal with that issue. He notes that Trump once conceded that Sidney Powell's bizarre election fraud theories were, quote, unsupported and sounded crazy. So he obviously didn't believe it, did he? Well, except that was on November 25. Maybe Sidney Powell changed Trump's mind. After that, we'll find out in court. There was another moment when Trump berated Mike Pence for not wanting to overturn the election, and Pence responded that he thought there was no constitutional basis for such authority and that it was improper. Then Trump said, quote, "You're too honest." Now, does that mean that Trump was admitting to lying? I don't know. Seems like a figure of speech to me, personally. Did you have any thoughts on that one?
Well, you know, when you're trying to get into somebody's head and somebody's heart, it is very, very difficult. You could read an implication into that, that he's saying, well, you know, you're too honest, Mike, as opposed to me. I'm not particularly honest as well. But it's all down to implication and the meaning of the words. We've been down this path so many times with Donald Trump.
Anyway, this is what the court case is going to be like. There are heaps more examples. I'm going to go into them into the PEP podcast right there. I'm going to go into way more detail on this case there, but you don't want to hear that now. But now, I think this is a concern for the indictment. What do you think?
Well, we talk often about the protected right to free speech, the First Amendment of the United States Constitution. But just like the Second Amendment, which is the right to bear arms, there are limits. You can have a gun in America, but you can't have a nuclear bomb. For instance, when it comes to free speech, there are limits, a definition as to what is protected free speech. Back in 1919, Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes famously said, "You do not have the right to yell fire in a crowded theatre." And that's kind of the turn of phrase that is often brought out as an example, a way of understanding limits on free speech. But in this case, they're essentially saying, well, Donald Trump yelled fire in a crowded theatre because he smelled smoke, he saw flames. He truly believed it. And if he truly believed it and that he was saying something that was to the benefit of this crowd in a theatre, get out of here, it's on fire, well, it can then become defensible. In fact, you can yell fire in a crowded theatre. One, if there is a fire, or two, if you reasonably believe that there is a fire in that theatre.
Yeah, so what they're trying to do in this case is they're trying to prove that he said he was smelling smoke, but he wasn't actually smelling smoke. As in, the limits of free speech is when you con people.
Yeah. So all these people are saying, well, I told him there was no fire, but he kept yelling fire. And then, of course, he had a few people like Sidney Powell saying, oh, no, there's a fire. There's definitely a fire.
Yeah.
He chose to believe the people that he wanted to believe that were conforming to what he wanted, which was to still be president. So the question now...
Fire away, John.
Yeah, exactly. The question now is whether Donald Trump is actually going to be heading back to the White House or being sent to the big house. And right now, either scenario seems just as likely. We already know he's going to be seeing a lot of the inside of courthouses over the next year or two. So here's a wrap for you of what's currently on the docket and how it's going to coincide with the election itself.
Former President Trump could soon face criminal charges. Trump's lawyers confirming he's been invited to testify before a Manhattan grand jury.
Never a good sign, and in late March, Trump made history when he was indicted by that grand jury. The first time a former president of the United States ever faced criminal charges, arrested and arraigned in court.
President Trump, will you come speak to us? President Trump?
In total, Trump was charged with 34 felony counts relating to the payment made to former adult film actor Stephanie Clifford, known as Stormy Daniels, to hush up their alleged affair before the 2016 election.
I never thought anything like this could happen in America. Never thought it could happen.
Clearly. So, what happened?
He asked me to pay off an adult film star with whom he had an affair, and to lie about it to his wife.
Trump's former personal attorney Michael Cohen paid Stormy Daniels $130,000 to keep quiet about having sex with Trump. Cohen says, as president, Trump repaid him in monthly installments. Prosecutors allege that Trump falsified business records. The hush money was entered in account ledgers under legal fees, and that's illegal.
Oh, you guys must have planned this. You're trying to frame me.
Oh, and committing any offence to cover up another offence makes it an even bigger deal, rising to the level of a crime, not just a misdemeanor. And in this case, prosecutors are alleging that Trump first engaged in
a scheme to buy and suppress negative information to help Mr. Trump's chance of winning the election.
And then came the accounting cover-up. Michael Cohen already confessed to his part in the scheme in 2019 and served over a year in prison. The case against Trump is due to go to trial in New York on March 25th next year. That is slap bang in the middle of the Republican primaries. If convicted, the charges carry a maximum penalty of 136 years in prison. But we're just getting started. Special counsel Jack Smith issued his first indictments against Donald Trump in June. They related to Trump's retention and improper storing of hundreds of official documents, including some marked top secret and classified, after he left the White House in 2021. Trump's defence:
I had every right to have these documents.
Wrong. In fact, you are not supposed to take presidential papers with you, and you are certainly not supposed to resist efforts to recover them. You're not supposed to lie about what you still have, or tell staff to shuffle them around storerooms, ballrooms, even bathrooms in your golf resorts. Trump is facing charges including willful retention of national defence information, including nuclear secrets and war plans, and conspiracy to obstruct justice. If guilty, he would be facing decades behind bars just for that. It's serious stuff. That trial is due to begin in Florida on May 20th, 2024, when only 5 states will still be to vote for the Republican presidential nominee. And in late July, Smith issued further indictments in that documents case, alleging a conspiracy to cover up efforts to hide the documents, getting staff to try and erase security camera footage. And then there's the case of writer E. Jean Carroll, who won a civil suit against Donald Trump a while ago. The jury found that Trump was liable for sexually assaulting Carroll in the change room of a New York department store in the 1990s. It also found Trump's denial of the attack amounted to defamation, and it ordered him to pay $5 million in damages. But after that verdict, Trump wasn't backing down. In fact, he doubled down.
What kind of a woman meets somebody and brings them up, and within minutes you're playing hanky-panky in a dressing room, okay? I don't know if she was married then or not, but think of it.
So, E. Jean is claiming he's defamed her again. She's seeking undisclosed new damages, and that trial is set to begin on January 15th next year. That is the very day of the first-in-the-nation Iowa caucuses, when Republicans begin the process of picking their presidential candidate. At this stage, the first Trump trial on the docket is a civil fraud case. This is the one brought by New York Attorney General Letitia James. It's due to be heard in early October this year. Trump is accused of misrepresenting his net worth and the value of several properties to try and deceive several banks.
Claiming you have money that you do not have does not amount to the art of the deal. It's the art of the steal.
If convicted of that, he's facing a ban from doing business in New York and a $250 million fine. But now comes what could be the really big one politically. Special counsel Jack Smith's indictments over an alleged conspiracy headed by Donald Trump to hang on to power after losing the 2020 presidential election. 4 felony indictments: 1 of defrauding the United States, 2 counts of obstructing the vote certification, and another for violating the civil rights of voters he wanted to discount. Combined, if guilty, that all carries a maximum 55 years behind bars, but it is likely to be far less. Taken all together, the 77-year-old former president is now facing combined sentences measured in centuries. Unlike hush money, defamation, accounting crimes, even the secret documents case, this latest one goes to a pretty fundamental attack on the American Constitution and its democracy. Delaying the most serious cases, winning back the presidency, taking over the Justice Department, halting federal prosecutions, and arranging pardons may be Trump's only way of staying out of jail.
Okay, so there are a lot of trials there, John.
A lot of trials.
But not all trials are created equal. For example, that Stormy Daniels hush money indictment from Alvin Bragg you mentioned at the beginning, that's considered by many to be quite a flawed indictment. You might recognise Noah Feldman, for instance, from the first Trump impeachment. He is no fan of Trump's, but he notes that in New York, falsifying business records, which is what Trump has been charged with, is a minor misdemeanor. To make it a serious felony, you need to prove that the falsification of the record was intended to commit and hide another crime. Now, the other crime hasn't been confirmed, but it seems to be a violation of election law, is what they're going for, by hiding a campaign contribution. Fine. Except Trump can easily say that he hid the hush money to avoid upseeing his wife, not to conceal payments to the campaign.
Yeah, that's clearly a major concern of him all the time. Not upsetting Melania.
Reasonable doubt, John, reasonable doubt. But there's also another issue. This whole case is quite speculative because Trump was running for president, which is a federal office. So can a federal campaign finance crime be the basis for a New York state crime? The whole thing makes my head hurt. By contrast, the Mar-a-Lago documents case is super straightforward. That's a better indictment. Even more so after this week. Trump took defence-related documents. They were everywhere, in bathrooms, on the stage. Trump wasn't supposed to have any of these. Simple. Trump said that he'd already declassified the documents. Then this tape came out.
Milley, let me see that. I'll show you an example. He said that I wanted to attack Iran. Isn't it amazing? I have a big pile of papers. This thing just came up. Look. This was him. They presented me this. This is off the record, but they presented me this. Except it is like highly confidential, secret. This is secret information. But look at this. You attack. This was done by the military, given to me. I think we can probably, right?
I don't know. We'll have to see. Yeah, we'll have to try to
Declassify.
figure out a
See, as president, I could have declassified it. Now I can't, but this is classified.
Now we have a problem.
Isn't that interesting?
Yeah.
But Trump said those weren't actually secret documents.
There was no document. That was a massive amount of papers and everything else talking about Iran and other things. And it may have been held up or may not, but that was not a document. I didn't have a document per se. There was nothing to declassify. These were newspaper stories, magazine stories, and articles.
Then this week, Jack Smith altered the indictment to include that they had found the exact document that Trump had shown those reporters, and it was a secret classified defence-related document. Now, there is one catch. To convict Trump of willfully retaining national defence information, which is what they're trying to do, you need to show that Trump had reason to believe the document could be used to the injury of the United States or the advantage of a foreign nation. Now, I think war plans against Iran probably qualify for that. But even if they didn't, Trump's been charged with a number of obstruction charges as well. And Jack Smith literally has surveillance footage of Trump's goons carting documents around Mar-a-Lago, hiding them from Trump's own lawyer. And by the way, one of those same goons managed to mysteriously drain the Mar-a-Lago pool into a room full of computers used to store surveillance footage. Now, that didn't actually work, trying to destroy the computers, but John, I reckon it'll work pretty well to land some obstruction charges, don't you think?
They should have used bleach, clearly.
Yes.
Look, there's no doubt on that Mar-a-Lago documents case, Chaz, they've got Trump bang to rights. And it's not just a legal open and shut case in the view of many, but also politically, potentially, this could prize away some national security Republicans, because this does go to, even though it happened after he was president, it goes to Trump's fitness for office. This is a reckless, stupid thing to do. It is sloppy with national secrets, and also he clearly lied about it. He clearly lied about it, so he's perjured himself, he's obstructed justice, but it was just dumb. And it should be a reminder to some sensible Republicans that Donald Trump was actually not very good when it came to handling foreign affairs. He did some dumb things as president as well. But you're right, that Alvin Bragg case, the hush money case, I don't see any political damage for Donald Trump in that. At the end of the day, some Trump supporters are going to go, sure, I would have paid off a porn star to keep quiet if it meant I won an election. That's not disqualifying at all. And you're right, it's a technicality and it's a pretty flimsy case. So really interesting to see, with all these indictments piling up, Does he get convicted on the small beer and gets to punt on everything else, or do they shuffle the timetable around? It's going to be fascinating to see.
They're going to have to make some decisions because there are so many cases piling up. Each one affects the other ones because the existence of one case affects the preparation for the next case. And Trump's lawyers are going to make that point in every single trial. And so if they choose the wrong cases to go first, it's going to put off potentially better cases down the line till after the election.
Already today, Trump's lawyers were arguing that they should put off the latest trial, the January 6th case, for 3.5 years because that's how long the Justice Department has had to investigate it. We should have 3.5 years to be able to come up with our defence. But if you actually think back, when was January 2021? That was 2.5 years ago. So that's already, well, I guess he's maybe a better lawyer than he is an accountant. But let's get a legal opinion from an expert on constitutional and civil rights law. Caroline Fredrickson is a past president of the American Constitution Society and a member of the President's Commission on the Supreme Court, as well as being visiting professor at Georgetown Law. Professor, welcome to Planet America.
It's a pleasure to be with you.
Since these indictments came down, there's been a bit of talk about what was on Trump's mind. Did he make knowingly false claims that the election was stolen, despite all the advice and the evidence that said that it was not stolen? Why does that question of what he actually knew matter so much?
Well, so here's the real issue is that much of the indictment really depends on the question of Donald Trump's intent. So whether he believed the statements were false or not is really a crucial element. And one could say that arguably there's not any smoking gun evidence that shows that Donald Trump had the actual requisite criminal intent. That is, he was knowingly transmitting and relying on false information. But there is a whole lot of circumstantial evidence that would indicate that he knew pretty darn well that what he was saying was false and what he was asking people to do was actually very illegal.
So, Professor, can the prosecution make their case by applying the reasonable person standard and saying that Trump was being willfully blind, or do they have to actually prove that Trump genuinely believed his own claims?
Well, I think the reasonable person test comes into the analysis of whether Trump really could have believed that he was defrauded or that the vote was somehow rigged. It is more a question of that understanding than a reasonable person standard per se, because you still do have to prove that sort of state of mind of the defendant, in this case Donald Trump, that he knew perfectly well that the election was over, that he lost, and then what he tried to do subsequently was to try and steal the election.
Already President Trump's supporters have flagged a potential free speech defence. The indictment sort of tries to head that off. It acknowledges the argument, but also says here's why it doesn't apply. Why could that be key to this case?
If he was deluded and really believed that he won the election, then he wasn't knowingly making false statements. And so that's why the First Amendment piece is important. But it really is a quite questionable strategy to suggest that the president was delusional, because it really you wonder about the way that his campaign is going to be affected by a defense that rests on the fact that the President Trump was really out to lunch and not living in reality.
Okay, let me try one more defense on you. Could Trump argue, well, I just listened to Rudy Giuliani and John Eastman. They're lawyers, and I trusted them more than the people who told me to give up. So I just followed their advice.
Well, there is a very limited ability to say that you depended on the advice of counsel when counsel themselves were actually telling you that you had not won the election. And he was told that by people from the Justice Department, from the White House counsel's office, from multiple other people, including some of the people he then later relied on. But the weight of the lawyer's advice to him was, get over it, essentially. You lost.
We did see, of course, just last week, some additional superseding indictments in that earlier classified documents case that Special Counsel Jack Smith has brought. Are you expecting that we could see superseding indictments in this case? Could there be more, maybe based on those unindicted 6 co-conspirators once they put the squeeze on them a little bit?
Oh, absolutely. And that's surely the strategy that they're following, that they are putting real pressure. We know that Giuliani, whose lawyer has already acknowledged that he is one of those conspirators, conspirator one, I believe, has been turning over reams of evidence and talking to the prosecutors. So, they're squeezing hard. There's evidence that they haven't seen yet that they're going to get. There's testimony that they haven't heard yet that they're going to hear. And so, I think they're going to put the squeeze on these people as much as they can. I mean, they're facing real prison time. And that is, there's no better way to make people start to talk than threatening them with a hard time.
Professor, do you think there's any realistic chance that both this case and the Mar-a-Lago documents case could be completed before the election? And if not, which of those 2 indictments do you think should be prioritised?
It's going to be hard, no doubt. I think this is the one to prioritize, as bad as it was that he stole national secrets and refused to give them back and hid them and tried to remove security cameras and, which is really troubling and dangerous. But let's face it, our democracy was threatened here on January 6th. And the effort to overturn an election is the one that has to come with the highest level of seriousness and attention. And I think that Judge Chutkan in D.C. is going to move quickly. She is a very smart, thorough judge, and she is going to set a trial schedule that is going to, I'm sure, move as quickly as is possible in order to give the defendant requisite time to respond, but also in order to complete the process in an expedited, or not an expedited fashion, but certainly not allow Donald Trump to drag it out for too long, which I think is what his strategy will be.
Carolyn Fredrickson, thanks for joining us on Planet America.
Thank you. It was a pleasure.
Now, you might recall just before the 2020 election, the New York Post ran a story based on the laptop of Joe Biden's son, Hunter. There were suggestions at the time that Hunter was pretty keen to take advantage of his dad's position to make a buck. But then over 50 senior intelligence officials signed a letter saying that the laptop story had all the classic earmarks of a Russian information operation. The media became super suspicious of the story. Twitter even blocked users from posting links to the story. But since then, we've learnt that the FBI had actually verified the authenticity of the laptop a year earlier by matching the laptop device number against Hunter's Apple Cloud ID. Yet they apparently deliberately conditioned social media companies to believe that the laptop was Russian disinformation for some reason, despite knowing at the time that it was legitimate. Strange. And that's not the only thing we've learned since then. In 2020, we were told,
my son has not made money in terms of this thing about, what are you talking about, China. I have not had, the only guy made money from China is this guy. He's the only one. Nobody else has made money from China.
But this week, Hunter admitted in court that he had made $2.4 million in 2017 and $2.2 million in 2018 alone, largely from Chinese and Ukrainian interests. And IRS whistleblowers have tracked down $17 million so far that Hunter has earned from various foreign interests. That money was distributed to at least 9 members of the Biden family in a manner that the IRS certainly took an interest in. But fine, so Hunter made himself some cash, seemingly off his dad's name. Not great, but it's common amongst Nepo kids, and it's not a massive issue unless Joe Biden was involved. Now look, we've heard this kind of thing many times.
Mr. Vice President, how many times have you ever spoken to your son about his overseas business dealings?
I've never spoken to my son about his overseas business dealings.
Except, since then, one of Hunter's ex-business partners went public to say that he did meet with Joe Biden as part of discussions about a potential deal between Hunter and a Chinese company. And Hunter's longtime friend and business partner, Devon Archer, also weighed into that this week.
It's been reported, and you have said that there were occasions when Joe Biden would call in with clients present on a speakerphone.
Right.
How many times do you think that happened?
I mean, over a 10-year partnership, I would, the number I'm going with is 20. That's probably the amount that I kind of reckon. Yeah, a lot. I don't know if it was an orchestrated call-in or not. It certainly was powerful, though, because, if you're sitting with a foreign business person and you hear the vice president's voice, that's prize enough. I mean, that's pretty impactful stuff for anyone in the world.
Interesting. But Hunter Biden putting his dad on speakerphone to impress his business partners is not a smoking gun pointing at Joe Biden. On the other hand, Republicans hope that this might be. Senator Chuck Grassley released an unverified FBI source report. I emphasise unverified. This is a highly unusual thing to do. The report involved the source writing about a number of conversations that they'd had with Zlotchevsky, the head of Burisma. Burisma is the Ukrainian company that hired Hunter Biden on a suspiciously hefty wage back in 2013. Now, I want to emphasise, while the FBI apparently does find this source to be generally credible, that doesn't mean this report is true. The source could be lying. Zlotchevsky could be lying to the source. The source explicitly said in the report that it's very common for businessmen in post-Soviet countries to brag or to show off about their connections. So maybe Zlotchevsky was just trying to impress associates with tall stories. But for what it's worth, the source says that Zlotchevsky told him that he hired Hunter to, quote, protect us through his dad from all kinds of problems. He also apparently said that although Hunter was stupid and Zlotchevsky's dog was smarter, Zlotchevsky needed to keep Hunter on the board so everything will be okay. He allegedly said it cost $5 million to pay one Biden and $5 million to pay another Biden. The source asked whether it was Hunter or Joe who told Zlotchevsky to retain Hunter on the board. Zlotchevsky said they both did. And here's the important bit. Zlotchevsky supposedly said he has many text messages and recordings that show he was coerced to make these kinds of payments. He says he has 17 recordings. According to the source, 2 of them allegedly include Joe Biden himself. All right, now that might all be nothing, but it's certainly worth investigating. Which leads us to the next interesting part of this story, the 2 whistleblowers from the IRS who were trying to investigate Hunter Biden, but were frustrated by what they saw as interference in their investigations.
Assigned prosecutors did not appear to follow the normal investigative process, slow-walked the investigation, and put in place unnecessary approvals and roadblocks from effectively and efficiently investigating the case. A number of times we were not able to follow the facts.
Furthermore, when Hunter Biden eventually got a slap on the wrist for some of his crimes involving unpaid taxes and lying on a form, Attorney General Merrick Garland maintained publicly that it was Delaware U.S. Attorney David Weiss, who is a Trump appointee, importantly, who decided on those charges. But the IRS whistleblower said,
he led Congress to believe the case was insulated from improper political influence because all decisions were being made exclusively by Delaware United States Attorney David Weiss, but that was not true. The Justice Department allowed the president's political appointees to weigh in on whether to charge the president's son. After United States Attorney for D.C., Matthew Graves, appointed by President Biden, refused to bring charges in March 2022, I watched United States Attorney Weiss tell a room full of senior FBI and IRS senior leaders on October 7, 2022, that he was not the deciding person on whether charges were filed.
So either that IRS whistleblower or Merrick Garland is lying. Finally, last week, the sweetheart deal that Hunter Biden had been offered fell apart when the judge discovered that the deal appeared to include immunity for Hunter from a whole bunch of other crimes that were being investigated. And importantly, some of them the Republicans accused Joe Biden have been associated with as well. So that is a very unusual plea deal, to say the least, and it joins a lot of unusual goings-on in the treatment that Hunter Biden has received over the last few years. Look, I don't think anything that's going to stick to Joe Biden has been proven yet. I don't think even really that close. But House Republicans are going to give it a red-hot go, so we'll see where this goes.
Yeah, we sure will. On that plea deal, Chaz, it was quite reasonable for the judge that was expected to just rubber stamp that plea deal to ask some pretty probing questions, and it turned out both the prosecution and the defence of Hunter Biden, they didn't really both understand the plea deal they had reached before they brought it to court, which showed perhaps that they were both just very anxious to get this thing over and done with. And that plea deal was basically guilty to not paying taxes 2 years in a row when Hunter Biden was off his chops on crack cocaine, and owning a gun when, as a drug addict, he should not have signed a form saying, "I'm not a drug addict, give me a gun." And so that was a pretty small cop. The fact that there was this other indemnity stuff that they didn't even understand, that was sloppy. That was very, very sloppy. But on the Joe Biden connection, I mean, this is deja vu all over again. This is the first Trump impeachment trial. It was all about, pinning Joe Biden to Hunter Biden getting money from Burisma. We know that Hunter Biden got a lot of money from Burisma. We know that Hunter Biden was an addict who had survived a terrible car accident as a child, lived with the trauma, the loss of his mother and his sister. In 2015, he lost his brother, his soulmate in Beau Biden. Here's a guy who was a screw-up when things were going okay in his life, even worse when the drugs became a major problem. He got kicked out of the Navy. Yes, he was trading on his father's name. No doubt about that. But did he do anything unlawful? Well, nothing that 5 years of investigations have been able to find. Did Joe Biden do anything unlawful? Did Joe Biden, 36 years in the Senate, 8 years in the vice presidency, wanting to be president since the age of 7, did he decide all of a sudden, in the final chapter of his life, he's going to become corrupt? Well, I find that a little bit hard to believe. And there's no evidence, but they're going to go looking for this evidence because we may well be seeing an impeachment inquiry.
Yeah, I gotta say, I do agree with you that it seems strange that Joe Biden would spend, 25 years being famously the poorest senator in the Senate, and then deciding to become corrupt.
Well, you would say that if you were a corrupt person all the time,
Just
Chaz.
at the moment, he might be president.
Those plugs don't come cheap, let me tell you.
Well, yeah, that timing seems odd to me as well, I have to say.
Yeah.
But I do want to say as well about the potential cover-up, the FBI element of this.
Yeah.
And by the way, you mentioned about the tax charges for 2 years. One of the things the IRS whistleblowers were bitching about was the fact that he didn't pay his taxes for a lot longer than 2 years.
Yeah.
But someone,
charged for those.
Someone at the FBI, the Department of Justice, allowed the other charges to lapse past the statute of limitations when Hunter's own defence lawyer wasn't asking them to.
Yeah.
And so they were going, that was very suspicious behaviour.
And on that question as well, Chaz, just briefly as well, the question of, well, is Merrick Garland lying, or are these IRS whistleblowers lying, or are they just mistaken, incorrect in some way, or has there been a miscommunication? David Weiss says, well, no, I was not pressured. He rejects that suggestion. He says this was the Trump appointee. He says that this was an independent decision to reach this agreement, and I could have gone further, but there was no requirement to.
Yeah, and just to finish off that area, if there is one or two people who turn out being trying to put their thumb on the scales of Hunter's cases, which there may or may not be, that doesn't mean the entire FBI and Department of Justice is corrupt, which is what some people are running with. We need to defund them all.
Yeah.
Like, you can have some people who are hacks, and we've seen this many times already over the last few years.
Sure.
A few people are hacks, and it smears everyone else's good name.
Yeah.
So we should just bear that in mind.
And we should also bear in mind that Hunter Biden would be far from the first person to trade off their last name when they've got a powerful relative. I mean, Jared Kushner made literally billions off being a Trump, the rest of the Trump family. But, there are black sheep in every family who go on the grift, and they usually stay on the right side of the law. We don't know if Hunter went too far in this case, but so far they have found nothing compelling.
If we are making the Trump comparison, we should note that we don't know if Joe Biden got money from Hunter's operations yet. There's no evidence so far.
None at all.
But we know for a fact that Donald Trump got money from Donald Trump Jr.'s operations because Donald Trump didn't divest himself from ownership of the company.
Yeah.
So since Donald Trump was getting everything that Donald Trump Jr. did, Donald Trump got a slice of while he was president.
Okay, so we don't know about criminality. We do know about hypocrisy right now. In a moment, we are going to have a fireside chat, but...
Oh, yeah, before that, we should say, we've been talking about Hunter Biden for the last, 7 minutes or something.
Seems like it.
But you need to not get confused between this Hunter and the Hunter that's responsible for a 1984 Tasmanian children's show. I'll just point out the difference to you, and you are not going to thank us for this.
Hunter, with his very smart cat in his mouse. Hunter, and his computerized gadget-filled house. On his bike or in his den, he's always looking around and then he's asking...
Yeah, thanks so much for clearing up any ambiguity or confusion over which hunter we've been talking about and giving us an earworm that will plague us for weeks. It is time for a fireside chat. We're going to crunch some numbers and look at the campaign as it is. A Siena poll out this week from the New York Times would have been very welcome reading in the Trump camp, despite or perhaps because of these mounting legal challenges facing the former president. His lead over his nearest rival, Florida Governor Ron DeSantis, continues to grow. In the last Siena poll, October last year, Trump was leading DeSantis by 23 points, with former Vice President Mike Pence registering 6% support and former UN Ambassador Nikki Haley on 3. Well, this week, Trump is up 5 points. His lead has ballooned, though, to 37 points because support for DeSantis has fallen by 9 percentage points. Bit of bad news as well there for Mike Pence.
Yeah, and even if DeSantis could get rid of all the other candidates, you'd think he'd stand a chance against Trump? No. That Siena poll says that Trump would be beating DeSantis 62 to 31. Ouch! Even worse for DeSantis, his whole candidacy is based on being the electable Trump without the baggage. But according to Monmouth, 69% of Republican voters say Trump is either definitely the strongest or probably the strongest candidate against Biden.
Yeah,
so much for electability.
That Siena poll as well, Chaz, this week, no outlier. Pretty much in line with a lot of the early state polls, although one or two in New Hampshire put the two a little bit closer. It is certainly, though, spot on the average of national polls from Real Clear Politics, where, take a look, Trump is almost 36 points in front. 6 months ago, DeSantis had closed that to 14. He's going backwards. Sadly, for Ron, the more Republican primary voters see of him, the less they seem to like him. The DeSantis campaign is in a whole lot of trouble. They're laying off staff. Their major donors are getting very, very worried. They're shutting their wallets. They're calling for a reset of the campaign.
DeSantis has even starting to give interviews to the mainstream media.
A sure sign of desperation.
Until now, honestly, he largely did literally softball interviews.
But I'll tell you, you know, as governor, and if you're a determined executive, you know, you can make things happen, and we've done that in Florida.
That is weird. But right now, Chaz, the mantra in the DeSantis campaign is, let Ron be Ron. But maybe that's the problem, Ron being Ron, because he's just so Ron. For more than 2 weeks now, Ron has been on the defensive over a controversial piece of guidance for the teaching of history in his home state of Florida.
One rule that teachers must now follow requires middle school students to learn, quote, how slaves developed skills, which in some instances could be applied for their personal benefit.
Now, Ron DeSantis didn't have anything to do with the specifics of that curriculum guidance, but he says he does support it.
I think that they're probably going to show some of the folks that eventually parlayed being a blacksmith into doing things later in life.
Well, that's all being reported as Ron DeSantis defends slavery. Vice President Kamala Harris has been leading the chorus of outrage.
Middle school students in Florida to be told that enslaved people benefited from slavery. They insult us in an attempt to gaslight us, and we will not have it.
Well, it's not exactly what it says. Meanwhile, Republican presidential rival Senator Tim Scott had a gentler rebuke.
There's no silver lining in freedom, in slavery. The truth is that anything you can learn, that any benefits that people suggest you had during slavery, you would have had as a free person. I would hope that every person in our country, and certainly running for president, would appreciate that. And listen, people have bad days. Sometimes they regret what they say, and we should ask them again to clarify their positions.
But as this whole controversy has dragged on and on, Ron DeSantis has become more and more defiant. But he's also been really struggling to make his case.
And that particular provision about the skills, that was in spite of slavery, not because of. The AP course has made that same point. Other courses have made that same point.
Now, Ron DeSantis has got some defenders, Chaz, like Jesse Waters on Fox News.
This is historical fact that slaves did develop skills while they were enslaved and then used those skills as blacksmiths, as in agriculture, tailoring, in the shipping business, to then use to benefit themselves and their families once they were freed.
But Jesse Waters is one thing. This is one of the scholars on the panel that came up with the wording that has created such a backlash. This is William Allen. He's a doctor, former chair of the US Commission on Civil Rights.
It wasn't just the individuals who benefited, but this entire nation ultimately benefited from it.
and that could have been expanded. But anything that would deny benefit deriving from human exertion, even under the extreme conditions of oppression, would be false, and it would be dehumanizing.
Also, importantly, I want to pick up on that point that Ron DeSantis made in the quote before. The quote from the Florida curriculum standards that everyone was so offended by was this: instruction includes how slaves develop skills which in some instances could be applied for their personal benefit, right? Whereas the quote from the previous history course that course replaced, the one that everyone was criticising Ron DeSantis for getting rid of, the one that Kamala Harris explicitly supports, says this: once free, African Americans use those skills to provide for themselves and others. It's exactly the same point. This story is a huge beat up, John, often pushed by Donald Trump surrogates.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. It is a beat up, but the point is it's a nuanced argument, and Ron DeSantis has completely failed to effectively state his case. Instead, he just keeps looking like he's Ron DeSantis defending slavery. He's certainly not been a great media performer so far in his campaign. Last week, for instance, he was asked whether he would consider the controversial Democratic presidential candidate, Robert Kennedy Jr., as his running mate. Now, Kennedy is the son of the late Senator Robert Kennedy. He was assassinated, of course, running for president in 1968. He's nephew of John F. Kennedy, killed 5 years earlier. Most of the Kennedy clan have shunned Robert Kennedy Jr. because he peddles conspiracy theories like this around vaccines and COVID.
Democratic presidential candidate Robert F. Kennedy Jr. is facing criticism for spreading false claims about COVID-19.
He repeated a conspiracy theory that the virus was, quote, ethnically targeted against certain groups while sparing Jewish and Chinese people.
Well, not surprisingly, DeSantis said no to the idea of Vice President Kennedy, but not because of his anti-vax, anti-science, anti-Semitic stuff.
Yes, the medical stuff, I'm very good on that. So that does appeal to me, but there's a whole host of other things that he'd probably be out of step with. And so on that regard, it's like, okay, if you're president, sick him on the FDA if he'd be willing to serve, or sick him on CDC. But in terms of being Veep, if there's, 70% of the issues that he may be averse to our base on, that just creates an issue.
Yeah, some on social media, like anti-MAGA attorney Ron Filipkowski, interpreted those comments as DeSantis basically saying that he would consider Kennedy to be in charge of the Food and Drug Administration or the Centers for Disease Control. The next day, DeSantis was again trying to explain himself.
He asked me about RFK Jr. for VP because there's chatter on our side about doing that. And I said no, because ultimately he's a liberal. Like, we agree on Fauci. We agree on the medical swamp and how pharma has taken FDA captive. So we are going to clean house on that. I've said that from the beginning. I mean, we're going to drain the medical swamp in D.C.
As far as the media are concerned, he was just trying to clean up another gaffe.
Ron DeSantis has walked back his comments, saying that he's open to appointing Robert F. Kennedy Jr. to head either the FDA or the CDC should he be elected president in 2024.
So, of course, the point really in all of this that Ron DeSantis has failed to address, Chaz, is that Robert F. Kennedy Jr. is no more qualified to be on a bipartisan panel investigating the Centers for Disease Control and the Food and Drug Administration than he is to head those organisations. He's an anti-vaxxer, and bizarrely enough as well, a lot of his Robert Kennedy Jr.'s campaign money is coming from major Trump donors. So what's going on here? I don't know.
Yeah, a lot of people are saying it might be a spoiler, but honestly, I think that the Republicans actually like RFK Jr., and that's why Ron DeSantis is pandering.
He's probably closer to Trump than DeSantis is.
He may be. According to Quinnipiac, RFK has 48% approval amongst Republicans, but only 21% approval amongst Democrats, the primary he's supposedly in. Fox News has been loving Kennedy for years. Since he announced, Fox News has hosted him 10 times on their weekday broadcast, which is more than they've hosted Ron DeSantis or Chris Christie or Mike Pence. Now, you might be saying, they want him to spoil Biden. Of course they're doing that. But consider this, in that Siena poll we've been talking about all day, RFK has a favourability rating of 53 to 23 unfavourable. That's amongst Republicans, which is more popular than Mike Pence amongst Republicans, who is 44% favourable to 45% unfavourable. And amongst Republicans aged 18 to 29, RFK's favourability is, get this, 67% to 1%. 1% unfavourable. He's got 1% unfavourables amongst young Republicans. I reckon they just like him.
Yeah, and even some Democrats like him. Robert F. Kennedy Jr. got 20% in a couple of early primary polls against Joe Biden. He's averaging around 14 or 15%. That is enough to worry about, certainly based on the kinds of things that he says. But look, that is it for our first trip back to Planet America for this year. And it is great to be back.
It is, but before we go, not everyone made it back this year on the show. Those long-term Planet America viewers are going to be in no doubt as to who I'm referring to when I say that the most popular member of the team unfortunately didn't make it. So we just like to finish by wishing a very good boy farewell. And we'll see you guys at the same time next week. Bye-bye.